The Origins of the Object-Subject Antithesis in Lutheran Dogmatics, A Study in Terminology, by Jaroslav Pelikan. One of the tasks with which both Christian preaching and Christian dogmatics are confronted is the attempt to express biblical testimony in non-biblical terminology. Such an attempt is as difficult as it is necessary. In order to perform its responsibility, the proclamation of the Christian message in preaching must resort to ways of speaking that are not found in the Scriptures. Similarly, theologians have always found it necessary to collect into one expression what is said in several different parts of the Scriptures. But the difficulty in any such expression is that a word taken over from extra-Christian sources may often bring with it connotations that are foreign to biblical faith. That necessity and that difficulty are almost exactly parallel. In their definitions and discussions of the meaning of the Christian faith, the great Lutheran dogmaticians of the 16th and 17th centuries were faced by this fact. From the example of the ancient Church, it was evident to them that theology could not avoid the use of a vox agraphos to summarize a particular biblical doctrine. And as Lutheranism came into conflict with various sects, it had to insist that not all dogmatic terms appear expressis verbis in the Scriptures, but that they are nevertheless justified as summaries of what the Scriptures teach. Professor Pieper has pointed out in this connection that we have the heretics to thank for the fact that the Church has had to invent these terms. Several examples of such terms suggest themselves. The term sacramentum, practically indispensable in theology, is a vox agraphos, having its origins in civil law. In the latter part of the 17th century, it seems to have become necessary for Lutherans to point out that it was not the Lord Jesus, but Tertullian, who had first called baptism a sacramentum. Another such term is persona, as used in the doctrine of the Trinity. Though there were some who regarded persona as a valid translation for hypostasis in Hebrews 1:3, the fact remained that the ancient Church had coined a dogmatic terminology for which it was not always easy to find biblical equivalents. In the same connection, the term essentia, as applied to God, also created difficulties. All three of these terms, sacramentum, persona, essentia, were necessary, but they also constituted a problem for the careful dogmatician. That problem became even more acute in the case of those terms which do not summarize a particular doctrine, as do those referred to above, but which are rather employed as methodological devices in the exposition of all Christian doctrine. Among the most familiar methodological devices of this latter sort in Lutheran dogmatics are the Aristotelian distinction of substantia and accidents, and the Aristotelian distinction of causes. But fully as important as either of these is the distinction of objectum and subjectum, together with the assumptions that lie behind that distinction. Because this antithesis between object and subject is so central in the terminology and methodology of the Lutheran dogmaticians, it deserves careful attention on the basis of the sources. In an effort to interpret the significance of the object-subject antithesis in Lutheran dogmatics, the present essay will seek to analyze the historical origins of that distinction in the dogmaticians of the 16th and 17th centuries. The ultimate origins of the object-subject antithesis lie in the Greek interpretation of truth, though the terminology itself is a later medieval invention. In Professor Kahler's words, quote, "These are not biblical terms, but they are used by dogmaticians," unquote. Their origin is, then, to be sought outside the Bible, and more specifically in the Greek understanding of aletheia. For the Greeks, truth meant that a statement or proposition was an adequate representation of an external reality. Underlying that view is Greek monism, by which God and man were thought of as living in continuity, so that the idea in the mind and the reality outside the mind stood in relation to each other. Even when the external reality is vague, as in the Platonic doctrine of ideas, this definition of truth remained. When Greek thought was amalgamated with Christian thought in medieval theology, this Greek view of truth played a prominent role. As Rudolf Eucken has pointed out in his study of the object-subject antithesis, these terms first appear in Duns Scotus. As part of his metaphysics, Duns found he had to distinguish between truth as it is outside the mind and truth as it is inside the mind. Quote, "The word subjective was applied to whatever concerned the subject matter of the judgment, that is, the concrete objects of thought. On the other hand, the term objective referred to that which is contained in the mere obicere, i.e. in the presenting of ideas, and hence qualifies the presenting subject." It is evident that Duns' use of the term was the exact opposite of their use today. Nevertheless, it was he who introduced the objective-subject antithesis into the discussion of philosophical truth, and from there into the framework of Christian theology. Because both Luther and Melanchthon were opposed to the speculative metaphysics of the medieval doctors, the Scotist version of object and subject does not appear as such in the main body of their theology. Rather, the terms objectum and subjectum in earliest Lutheran theology would seem to owe their origin to humanist grammar and humanist psychology. Melanchthon's Liber de Anima had a fully developed theory of objectum in the modern sense. As each of the five senses has objecta peculiar to it, so God and all things are the proper externum objectum of the intellect, and the good is the proper objectum of the will. And in this case, Christian faith too may be said to have objecta, that is, things to which it attaches itself. Taking his cue from Melanchthon, Aegidius Hunnius also spoke of, quote, objectum cognitionis Deus ipse, unquote. When the credo in unum Deum of the Nicene Creed is parsed, Deum will be seen to be the object, and an implied ego in credo the subject. By this grammatical distinction, objectum fide eventually became a technical term of Lutheran dogmatics. The term subjectum, on the other hand, does not seem to have been clarified for a long time. During the 16th century, it is used synonymously with substantia, and therefore in contexts where we would probably use the term object. Even though the grammatical implications of the term subjectum were set down in opposition to the Calvinistic interpretation of the word, the confused use of the term remained. The clearest statement of subjectum fide, in contradistinction to the objectum fide, is that of Johann Gerhard, quote, subjectum fide est homo, unquote. With the exceptions noted, Lutheran theology had developed the distinction between the knowing subject and the known object by the middle of the 17th century, and was applying it to the articulation of Christian truth. Once the distinction had established itself, it pervaded the entire corpus doctrinae of the Lutheran dogmaticians. There is perhaps no locus in which the influence of the object-subject antithesis is more evident than in the description of faith that is to be found in the Lutheran dogmaticians. This can be seen from the familiar distinction between the fides quae creditur, objective, and the fides qua creditur, subjective. The distinction was most succinctly stated by the medieval scholastic Peter Lombard, and was taken over from him by the dogmaticians. Quote, that which we believe is one thing, the faith by which we believe is another, and yet both are called by the name faith, that which we believe and that by which we believe. Fides quae creditur is called fides materialis. Fides qua creditur is called fides formalis. For fides quae creditur is the object of fides qua creditur, unquote. Within the context of Lombard's semi-Pelagian theology, such a distinction had a definite place. For by knowledge of the fides quae creditur, a man was doing, quote, as much as is in him, unquote, and God would inevitably confer his grace upon such a man through the fides qua creditur. But when the distinction was transplanted into Lutheran theology, which was vigorously opposed to semi-Pelagianism, how was it to be reinterpreted? In adopting the Lombard's distinction of fides quae creditur and fides qua creditur, the Lutheran dogmaticians of the 17th century were led to lay undue stress upon the objective element in faith, employing New Testament passages for it that do not apply, a trend which Professor Pieper criticizes in them. In fact, Lutheran dogmatics elaborated the medieval distinction into a trichotomy of notitia, assensus, and fiducia, which Professor Pieper has also subjected to a very telling criticism. the trichotomy of notitia, assensus, and fiducia was introduced into Lutheran theology by Philip Melanchthon. Like the medieval distinction of fides quae creditur and fides qua creditur, this trichotomy also made room for the operation of the human will in conversion, for its central term, assensus, of which we shall have more to say later, was also the term in which Melanchthon expressed his synergism. After Melanchthon, the trichotomy was taken up by Tillemann Hess-Husius, 1527 through 1588, into the second edition of his dogmatics. Although Chemnitz divided faith into 4 parts instead of 3, the trichotomy eventually became standardized in the Lutheran dogmaticians. The crucial term in that trichotomy of notitia, assensus, and fiducia is the second, assensus. For as the distinction became more and more clear-cut, the term assensus and the verb assentire acquired more and more of an intellectual connotation. The insistence that faith is fiducia is a central affirmation of the Lutheran confessions, especially of the Apology, but the term assentire occurs in the Apology too. Significantly, it is used in contrast to the fides historica of Roman Catholicism, to the notitia historiae, seu dogmatum, which the intellectualism of Rome equated with faith. Faith, the Apology insists, is no mere intellectual agreement, in the Greek sense, that a set of propositions corresponds to external reality. Est autem fides propriae dicta, quae assentitur promissioni, de hac fide loquitur scriptura. This was in keeping with the usage of assensus and assentire at that time. In 1540, Caspar Cruciger employs assentire as virtually equivalent to obey. A generation later, the Latin version of the Formula of Concord speaks of evangelio vere credere aut assentire, et id pro veritate agnoscere. But assentire here serves to render the German das Ja-Wort dazu geben, and in a later paragraph, credere aut assentire is again a rendition of glauben oder das Ja-Wort dazu geben. Yet another generation later, in the work of Balthasar Meissner, quoted earlier, Christian assentire is explained, ut simul me totum ipsi quasi concredam, et omnibus cogitationibus in eum confidam. Thus, far from having an essentially intellectual content, assentire means the entrusting of the total person to God. It was then practically synonymous with fiducia, and was specifically ascribed to the voluntas rather than to the intellectus. At the same time, however, assensus could be ascribed to the intellectus. Melanchthon had connected voluntas and assentire as noted above, but it must be remembered that in Melanchthon's reinterpretation of Aristotelian psychology, the intellectus and the voluntas were almost equated. As a result, he could also ascribe assensus to the intellectus. Fides est notitia, qua ad sentimur dicto sine dubitatione, victi testimoniis vel autoritate, an intellectual and authoritarian act. Alongside the development sketched in the preceding paragraph, assensus voluntatis was the ascription of assensus to the intellectus. Of the two uses, the voluntaristic and the intellectualistic, the latter was to win the day. Thus, Hess-Husius attaches assensus to totum Dei verbum, and only fiducia to the promissionem gratuitam de remissione peccatorum. For Chemnitz, too, notitia and assentio belong to the mens, while desiderium and fiducia belong to the voluntas et cor. Like Hess-Husius, Balthasar Mentzer makes the entire Word of God the object of assensus, and only the grace of God the object of fiducia. In this, he was followed by Gerhard and by David Hollatz, both of whom placed the locus of assensus in the intellectus. Indeed, by the end of the 17th century, it had even become possible for a Lutheran theologian to maintain that the demons who believe and tremble have assensus as well as notitia, and lack only fiducia. Although the dogmaticians criticized the philosophical distinction between the intellect and the will, as had the Apology before them, they nevertheless made use of it in their definition of assensus, turning it from the response of the total person to the agreement of the intellect. In this way, the objective fides quae creditur could achieve a position of prominence, for the intellect deals with objective truth, while the will subjectively follows through on the objective truth which the intellect has grasped. The biblical use of pistuo, especially in James 2:19 and the pericope John 4:50-53, compelled the dogmatician to devise categories under which this sort of pistis could be distinguished from saving faith. From the Apology, they took the concept of a fides historica. In addition, they took the Apology's phrase fides specialis and made a technical term of it. Over and above these, they spoke of a fides dogmatica, a fides miraculosa, a fides generalis, and several others. The difficulty lay in ascertaining what continuity existed between these uses of pistis and the pistis by which men are justified. That continuity was localized in the fides quae creditur, the objective content which they all share. The difference between them lay in the fides qua creditur, the subjective element, which is present only in the regenerate. From all this, it would appear that the object-subject antithesis, with its corollary distinctions, performed a useful function in the classical Lutheran dogmaticians. It sought to give voice to the important theological declaration that there is a given in Christian faith, over which the believer has no disposition or control. Thus, the body and blood of Christ are present in the Lord's Supper, regardless of the worthiness of either officiant or recipient. I do not call God into existence by my faith in him, nor dare I write my own Bible. I must listen to the word which he has historically set down. This was the dynamic intention behind the object-subject antithesis. But the word studies presented here would seem to indicate that the form which this dynamic took in the object-subject antithesis and its corollaries left something to be desired as an expression and clarification of Christian doctrine. The distinction of object and subject in faith stems from the speculative metaphysics of Scotist philosophy, and yet it appears in Lutheran theology. The distinction of fides quae creditur and fides qua creditur stems from the semi-Pelagianism of medieval theology, and was taken over from there into the body of Lutheran dogmatics. The distinction of notitia, assensus, and fiducia stems from the synergism of Melanchthon's theology, and yet it was retained by the later Lutheran dogmaticians. This was accomplished in spite of the fact that Lutheran dogmatics vigorously opposed speculative metaphysics, medieval semi-Pelagianism, and Melanchthonian synergism. The only way these three distinctions could be accommodated to the structure of Lutheran theology was by an increased emphasis upon the role of the intellect in faith. In this way, the objective came to outweigh the subjective. And even when Pietism protested against the overemphases of its predecessors, it had to do so in terms of the object-subject antithesis, stressing the latter in preference to the former. It would seem, then, that neither the objectivism of 17th century Lutheranism nor the subjectivism of 18th century Lutheranism does complete justice to the biblical doctrine of faith as this appears in the New Testament, and as it was recovered in the faith of Luther and the theology of the Lutheran confessions.